Good morning, Sean here at Mountains Garage. I'm out here in the storage container. Today we're going to talk about the LS Flexplate and Flywheel and how things can go wrong in a hurry. It seems so simple. Let's get into it. In this video I'm going to talk about legacy transmissions. That's a name that's kind of caught on, and it means all your modern, and I'm using bunny ears for that. You know, let's say 60s on up, popular GM transmissions, Power Glide, Turbo 350, Turbo 400 over there in the corner, and eventually 4L80. Here's a 4L80E. They all used the same hub, the same converter spacing, everything. So every 4L80 installation, regardless of the engine in front of it, had legacy spacing. So let's go see what that looks like as far as the Flexplate goes. Okay, so now you have your legacy spacing transmission all the way up to 4L80, and you want to bolt it behind an LS motor. Now, GM is called everything Gen 3, Gen 4, whatever. They now call them all LS. You don't have to call it a Vortec because it's a truck and an LS because it's a car. They just lumped them all together, and so did the aftermarket. So let's just call them LSs. The LS has a .400 shorter crankshaft than a traditional smaller big block Chevy. So when they used the 4L80E behind the 4.8 or the 6.0, they used a flat flex plate and a .400 spacer and longer bolts to go through the spacer. The first couple years of production in the 4.8 and the 6.0, you could have a long crank. They just added this onto the crankshaft to make it exactly like the small and big block Chevy. Still use the flat flex plate. If you have that situation, just don't use this spacer, but continue to use the flat flex plate. This looks exactly like a small and big block Chevy one, 168 tooth, 6 holes. Very familiar stuff. And it bolts right on, you can't go wrong. They make the SF5 version of this too, the flat one. It's kind of important because it's two versions. You've got a flat and a convex or a dish or whatever you want to call it. I'm going to show you that afterwards. Go with the flat one. With the spacer, the longer bolts, you won't have any trouble. And let me show you one of the biggest reasons why. You can see my hands. This is a brand new stall converter. It'll fit a small or big block Chevy. And in this case, I'm putting it behind an LS motor. So I have my flat flex plate with my spacer. That spacer is hollow all the way through. The hub will come right through the end of it. And the bolt pattern lines right up. Piece of cake. Big important takeaway here, nothing is restricting the hub. So when I can install it against my motor, make sure I have a gap between 1/8 and 3/16 to pull the converter ahead. No more or no less. You don't want less than 1/8. You don't want more than 3/16 when you slide that converter ahead. But it's not going to hang up on the hub. Important. Behind every 5.3 and a lot of 4.8s, you're going to find this dished flex plate. Now, it's important to note on an LS, this dish is .400-ish. They all take the same starter. The ring gear ends up in the same place. But in this situation, they decided to make the hub and the converter longer, and the lugs and the spacing is different. So, in order to run this on this converter, first thing you gotta probably not notice till you get it all bolted in the car, is the bolt pattern's different. You can egg out the holes about half their width and you can make it work. But when you have a traditional torque converter and a traditional hub length, you gotta modify the holes. You have to run one of these. This is where the problem starts. Now, it seems pretty simple, right? You're just going to put it on the hub. In fact, this one's so tight right out of the box it won't fit. But it has a register in there. If you spend a lot of time on the LS forums or the transmission forums, a lot of people complain about their thrust being wiped out. In my experience, using a dish flex plate and this adapter, when you go to pull the converter ahead, because you want 1/8 to 3/16 spacing, and I find I end up with a big gap and usually have to run 3 washes, but it'll bottom in this hub. And the way it's made, you can't really just keep machining that because it's going to fall apart right here. But you can adjust it a little bit. So I make sure I can pull my converter forward toward the engine more than I want to. So I rest assured it's not hanging up on the hub, because this is just a direct hydraulic line to push on your thrust and wipe it right out. So if you're gonna, this is the most common one you're gonna find. You gotta modify your bolt holes. You gotta use the adapter and make sure the adapter's not gonna cause you to wipe out your thrust. You can buy an LS specific converter for your Turbo 400 or whatever legacy transmission you want to run, and it'll have the right hub on it and stuff. That's not the way I want to go, because now I got myself an oddball converter. There's literally millions of these converters for the traditional small and big block Chevy, and I'd just as soon run that on behind my LS. I don't need anything special. I don't need a longer hub. I don't want any of that because it just gets confusing. Now it's specific for one application. That's my opinion. You can do it if you want to. But if you're going to run one of these on one of these, and when you go to buy the SFI version, this is more popular. The dished one, be careful shopping. I go with the flat, the spacer. You buy the whole kit. The bolts, spacer, and flex plate. Can't go wrong. This one, you got to come up with your own bolts. Well, maybe they sell it with the bolts, I don't know. And you got to have one of these. It'll work. Just be aware that you can cause the problems. If I was going to use this right now, I got to chuck it up in the lathe, because I don't want it tight on my hub. I'm just going to push on my thrust. Should slip right through. You saw that one slide right on there, no problem. This one won't. I have to hammer it on there. All right, just to review, this is your flat flex plate. The adapter goes between the flex plate and the crankshaft, and it uses longer bolts. This was found ahead of a 4L80 installed behind a 4.8 or a 6.0. I'm not aware of any 4L80Es ever being installed behind a 5.3. I could be wrong, but I've just never seen one. But if there was, it would have this one, this flex plate. This is a much more popular 4.8, 5.3. Every half ton out there has got a 4L60E or 65 or 70. It has a dish and short bolts. If you want to run this, you got to modify your bolt pattern and run an adapter if you're a legacy type converter, or you're going to get an LS specific converter and not need the adapter. Also, to be aware, they make a bolt-on spacer that goes on the converter side that replaces that. Your bolts go through it. It accomplishes the same thing. I didn't have one to show you. In both cases, you can buy the SFI version of this. Everything still applies. It's just a better flex plate. And on the dished version, they also corrected the bolt pattern problem. At least gave you options of fitting your legacy style converter. So, all things to consider. This is the flat flex plate with a spacer, sitting like it would be bolted on the crankshaft. This is the dished version. Same situation. They're both flat on the bench. The ring gear ends up in the same place. They both use the same starter. So regardless of flex plate, the same starter is used. No issue there. Before 2007-ish, when the manual transmission truck disappeared from GM's lineup, GM used a .400 thicker flywheel to make up the difference, and a pilot bearing endo bushing that moved further out on the end of the crankshaft of the LS motor to use a traditional length input shaft. That .400 thick flywheel can be used to convert into your hot rod and use all your old Muncies and T10s and stuff like that. That flywheel is about $80. It has a flaw. The inner hole, like where the bolts go into the crankshaft, usually about yay big. It's about yay big. So your clutch disc hangs inside of it, making a 10.5-inch clutch pretty much not usable. 11-inch hangs in a little bit. 12-inch is pretty well even with it, kind of. That flywheel is readily available for $75 or $80. It's an option, but I don't usually recommend the imported stuff, but you can buy a Speedmaster, wherever that stuff's made, SFI rated, .400 thick, LS to traditional length input shaft flywheel for about $130. I've got a couple of them there. Pretty nice looking piece. And that takes care of your conversion along with the right pilot bearing and bushing. That way your input shaft is supported and you're on the splines where you used to be, not 0.400 ahead and not reaching the pilot bearing. So those are the only considerations really in a manual transmission application. And none of this is hard. It just gets confusing when you start mixing parts. But that's what hot rodders do. And just to add one more twist, the Corvette and Camaro Firebird in the early 2000s, that flywheel did not take into account the 0.400 added thickness needed to use a traditional input shaft. That stuff will not work in your old muscle car. Be aware. All right, I hope that unlocks a few mysteries of the LS flywheel and Flexplate. If GM had just made the crankshaft as long as the traditional one, maybe added that top bolt hole, maybe never stopped using it. I mean, they used it in the 50s and 60s, then it went away, and now we need it again. You know, who knows? We don't get to sit in on those meetings, and even if we did, I'm not sure they'd listen. But they always left us a little room, whether they meant to or not, to adapt that stuff. And I'm not sure they even knew at the time. Their aftermarket program does now, but what they've created, and they created a whole other market for themselves, whether they meant to or not, with the LS motor. I mean, it's a pretty good platform. Who knows? This is video number 50, I think. And I got about 500 subscribers. That means each and every one of you gets 10 videos of your own. Take them home, keep them for yourself. Just kidding. Again, subscribers every week. It's kind of fun watching. It's a slow process. I said I've shot 50 videos. I don't think I'm any better than the first one. I wasn't good in the first one. I'll keep trying. Talk to you later. Thanks for watching.